Seems at dusk, testimony at noon. My name is Raphael, and I keep men from lying to the mirror. I'm a bespoke tailor, chalk, shears, patience. 4 rooms above a bakery that believes butter is a form of truth. On paper, my job is pattern making and hand-felled hems. In practice, it's confession. People step onto the fitting block and tell me the story their body wants the world to hear. I carry a tape that knows more about strangers than their doctors do, a piece of beeswax that keeps the thread honest, and a thimble that wears my scar like a wedding band. I live with Marcus. He's a paramedic who can carry a man and a sentence at the same time. He comes home with road on his boots and somebody else's siren in his shoulders. We've been together 5 years, and we write our rules on a white index card taped to the fridge. Speak by noon. We wrote it last winter after a month of midnight honesty that only trained us for bigger lies. Noon is clumsy. That's why it works. The Tuesday the stitches were obedient and I wasn't. The shop smelled like steam and wool and an orange I had forgotten on the windowsill. I was pinning a charcoal jacket to make the lapel stop arguing with the clavicle it had been assigned when my phone lit the cutting table with its particular brand of judgment. The joint email Marcus and I use for deliveries blinked across the lock screen. Thank you for your stay, the Franklin Hotel. Time, 12:083:02. Points, 200 added. Noon arrived in my ribs like a tape snap. I didn't call. Our second rule is for anything not yet a disaster, 2 loops around the block before nomming it. My block is the rectangle between the shop door and the alley where the bakery tosses the day's ambitions. I walked it twice. A delivery truck side, the pigeons practiced insincere meetings, and the city said the sentence old neighborhoods rely on. You already know. At 1, the man who would ruin my posture arrived. His appointment was under D. Hargreaves, which told me nothing except he enjoyed initials. He stepped inside with that narrow confidence some men wear as if it were a tailored sleeve. He had a face made for cameras and a mouth that suggested the Eton tie had never apologized for anything. I recognized him the way a city recognizes a headline. Damian Hargreaves, political strategist, frequently photographed in other men's victories. "You're Raphael," he said, as if he were confirming a rumor. "And you're on time," I said, which is the only compliment I give before measurements. He stood on the block and let me circle him, arms out, chin lifted. I laid the tape across his shoulders and felt the exact moment his body forgot to be a press release. I measured chest, waist, seat, the scythe of mid-back where suits decide whether to be cruel. When I knelt to take the outseam, he looked down with a smile I pretended not to read. "Most men hold their breath here," I said. "Most men are cowards," he answered. He smelled like citrus and a meeting that had gone his way. When I lifted the tape along his inner thigh, just a brush, just work, he exhaled through his teeth and I said, 2 inches for comfort, out of habit and mercy. "For me or for you?" he said lightly. "For the truth," I said. He laughed the way men do when they've already given themselves permission. When he stepped down, he didn't put his shirt back on right away. He asked about cloth, English worsted, Irish linen, Italian cashmere, and I answered with my hands, laying bolts across his shoulders as if I were dressing an argument. He selected a midnight blue that looked like self-control and said, "I have a room at the Franklin. There's a balcony. We could discuss button stance in better light." I said, "I have a partner." He said, "I have meetings," and slid his card across the cutting table. It read nothing useful except the number of a man who wouldn't need to introduce himself twice. Marcus texted at 3, "Pile up at the bridge, I'll be home late, eat something real." I replied, "You too," and the words felt like bandages, useful, not beautiful. When the shop closed, I stared at Damien's card like it could do arithmetic. I finished a hem I could have done in the morning, rethreaded a machine that had not asked to be forgiven, and watched the light decide to fail. At 7, without deciding to, I put on my jacket and walked toward the Franklin as if my legs were children the city had agreed to supervise. Hotel corridors are honest the way alleys are. They don't pretend to be about you. He opened the door shirt-sleeved, barefoot, the sky practicing tin along the balcony rail. He smiled like an invitation had taken off its coat. "We're discussing button stance," he said, and stepped aside. I let my jacket slide onto a chair because it wanted to. He poured 2 drinks and made the glass a story. We talked about the hand-in-the-pocket line, the politics of trouser length, the way a lapel declares allegiance. He stepped closer to adjust the tape where it hung from my neck. His fingers pressed the secrets in my collarbone, and I understood the problem with promises. He kissed me like we were already forgiven. He put his hands on my hips with the confidence pattern makers call no ease. I kissed him back like a man who spends his days putting pins where fabric wants to lie. He tasted of oranges that had convinced themselves they were important. He asked here, without grammar, and I said yes, with my hands tangled in his hair. He was generous in ways that are learned and selfish in ways that are rehearsed. We moved together like 2 stitches crossing in a place nobody would see. I let myself be a body instead of a narrative. After, he lay on his stomach and watched me like a man who approves of his own taste. "You're going to forgive him," he said, meaning Marcus, meaning me. "I'm going to speak at noon," I said, and the room smelled like citrus and ambition and poor decisions wiped with clean towels. Back at the shop the next morning, I found it easy to lie to Wool. It had no stake in my favorite sins. The day asked very little except that Steam behave. At 11:30, a gossip vertical posted a photo of Damien outside my door. It was just a shoulder and a laugh, mine looking like applause, and his hand doing a persuasive job of being casual. The caption said, "Power's favorite Tyler," and the comments did their math. My phone buzzed with 2 messages at once, my director's polite version of panic and Marcus's careful one. "Can we talk now or later?" I walked our empty corridor loop, and the building hummed you already know. I went home at noon and told him. He stood by the sink with his hands on the edge like a man about to get good news from a bad sky. I told him about the hotel and the postcard of a balcony and where my mouth had been. I didn't rename anything. He looked at me for a long time until I knew what both of us looked like. Then he said, "Do you love him?" The way medical history is written down because it matters and kept brief because it hurts. I said, "I love the version of me that doesn't need to ask permission." He nodded as if gravity had just introduced itself with better manners. "Here's the price," he said gently. "No rooms we can't say out loud in our kitchen. And if you break a rule, you break it where I can see you, not later where I have to be heroic." I texted Damien, "We're done." He sent back a sentence men with very good suits enjoy. "You'll come back if anyone starts fitting you worse than I did." I blocked the number and the part of my brain that collects sentences started to cry, and I let it. Work tried to go back to being work. The suit moved toward its fittings. The city wore heaviness in whether the way certain men wear wealth. Damien sent a courier to pick up a bastard try-on and a note that said nothing. The suit came back from the second fitting with a button missing, and I told myself it meant nothing. That afternoon, I saw Damien stepping out of the Franklin with a reporter I used to let into my shop after hours because her questions were accurate even when her tape recorder was. They parted like professionals who never had to be brave. That night Marcus came home at 3 with someone else's blood in his eyebrows and held my face like he had the right to know its angles. "I don't like you less," he said quietly. "I don't trust you more yet." He kissed me like we were negotiating good faith, slow enough that I remembered why daylight is a sacrament. We took it to bed and left the lamp on because the shadows had not earned our privacy. He pressed my wrists into the mattress with his hands gentle enough to be clear and asked, "Here." And I said, "Now," and we practiced the religion of staying. 2 days later, I got a message from a client whose wedding date had moved forward because his father's health had moved backward. He needed his suit yesterday. I took a basted jacket, Damien's, off the mannequin and the lining spilled a secret. A tiny microphone stitched into the quarter seam, a wire no thicker than fear. I stood there with shears in one hand and proof in the other, and felt like a street had offered me a map. I called my friend Layla, who writes for the kind of paper that prints corrections like regrets. I told her something was rotting in the hem of my work. She met me in the bakery alley and breathed in when I handed her the piece of wire like a sin I wanted to return. "You sure it's not a vanity?" she asked, and I said I was done confusing flattery with permission. She looked at me the way reporters certify bodies before they cover them with names. "You'll be quoted as a source familiar with the garment," she said, "not the affair." The word hung between us like a second tape measure. I nodded. "The wind said you already know." The story ran soft but accurate. Private devices in public wardrobe, a paragraph about ethics, a sentence about campaign strategy, a photo of a suit line with my hands not in frame. Damien texted from a new number, "You'll be sorry," and I sent back a single period because men who make sentences for a living sometimes owe themselves that shape. When he came for his final fitting, he brought a smile with guard rails. He stood on the block and let me circle him with pins and the professional faith we owe the cloth that fed us. "We were good," he said softly, not a question. "We were exact," I said. "Those are different." He looked at me the way men look at themselves in good mirrors. "You'll miss me," he said lightly. "Not the version I used," I said, which wasn't brave so much as accurate. He paid his invoice and tipped too much and left smelling like oranges that had lost their case. The suit looked better than he did. I told myself that meant something, and for once it almost did. Marcus and I expanded the rule. We didn't write it down because we had learned who paper really serves. If something belonged to both of us, it had to do what morning does: arrive in a room that still needed making. If we wanted to do something stupid, we had to invent a smart version first and present it on a plate by noon. If I was going to be handled like an instrument, it had to be by a man who could also listen. We took a train to the ocean on a day that promised rain and delivered grace instead. We lay on our backs and watched gulls perform sentences that didn't need commas. He asked if I wanted out of the city. I said I wanted out of the part of myself that thinks exits are sexier than front doors. He grinned and said, "That's a bespoke request." And I said, "I know someone," and we kissed like men who didn't need an alibi. If you need the intrigue polished here, a strategist with a balcony, a suit with a secret, a tailor who took off more than he meant to. If you need the erotic signed and delivered, yes, my mouth learned the map of a stranger and my body remembered both its patience and its appetite. The lamp stayed on because responsibility isn't blindfolded. If you need an ending that keeps faith, there isn't one. There is me with chalk on my fingers and steam on my face. There is a man at my table with a heartbeat I intend to recognize at noon. And there is a city that keeps aligning its switches without complaint for a few hours at a time. The rest I cut to measure. The rest I stitch by hand.